Well, the federal government has come under fire for allowing foreign workers to plug gaps in a major resources project in Western Australia. Labor backbenchers have also joined union leaders in criticising the decision. The Prime Minister has made it clear she wasn't consulted and only found out on Wednesday after the deal was done. Well, for more, we're joined by Labor MP Nick Champion. Nick,
good morning.
Good morning to you. How do you reconcile this decision of allowing 1,700 foreign workers into the country when many other Australian workers are losing their jobs?
Well, look, obviously it's understandable that Australians should have some concerns and frustrations about this process, but what we have at the moment is an economy in transition. So we're losing jobs out of manufacturing predominantly in the southern part of the country, and meanwhile in the northern part of the country we have these massive resource projects, over $2 billion, which need to be developed and need need foreign labour, unfortunately, to be undertaken. And we have to be very careful here that we, if you like, don't cut off our nose to spite our face. Sure, there's 1,700 foreign workers coming in under this agreement, up to that many under this agreement, but 6,000 Australian jobs will be created because of it. So, we do have to be careful to see the whole picture here. Sure, there's up to 1,700 foreign workers under 457 visas, but there's 6,000 Australian jobs being created by this project as well.
What then do you make of union comments? So we've heard Paul Howes, obviously the AW National Secretary, saying it's bad news for Australian workers. In fact, he goes further. He says, I thought we were attacking these guys at the moment. Whose side are we on?
Well, look, I certainly understand unionists' frustration. I mean, they do have to deal with some very trying circumstances. Dealing with redundancies is not a fun job. I've done it myself. It tends to, your heart goes out to people when they lose their job, and we've got to do, as a government, everything we can to make sure those workers get the best chance to retrain and to reskill themselves for jobs that are opening up in the economy. But what we have to do is look at the national interest here, and we've got massive resources-based projects which are in remote Australia and which need electricians and boiler makers and the like to be actually facilitated. So it seems to me that in order to create 6,000 Australian jobs, we may need some foreign workers to do that. This is a sensible way of doing it. This agreement sets up a jobs board which says that you can only get a foreign work visa if that position has been advertised in Australia and no qualified Australian has applied to do it. So, there's safeguards in this agreement and there's jobs as a result of this agreement, and I guess I understand people's frustration, but I just caution people to have a look at the details of the agreement. And obviously, let's not cut off our nose to spite our face.
How can it be that the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, didn't find out about this decision, so she clearly wasn't involved in this decision-making process? She didn't find out until Wednesday.
Well, that's, I think, as a result of a newspaper report. I don't know if that's a fact or not. But this process went through Cabinet. It went through Cabinet and through caucus last year, in actual fact. It's fair to say that most of the caucus want Australians to be trained up and skilled first, and that's why in the previous budget, not this one, but in the previous budget, a whole lot of money was put into jobs and skills, and the Prime Minister's led the way in abolishing fees for TAFE courses and vocational education. I think the government's doing a lot in this picture, but we have to accept that in these massive projects, we just simply won't undertake them without both foreign capital and foreign labour. We'd prefer to do it with our own resources, but I think if it's a choice between having these massive resource projects or not having them, we've got to have them.
Nick Champion, you should not be surprised that this has again stirred the leadership pot as far as Julia Gillard is concerned. In fact, some conspiracy theorists would have it that the architects of this decision, being Chris Bowen and Martin Ferguson, are Kevin Rudd backers. You yourself were a Kevin Rudd backer. Those conspiracy theorists would say, well, this is all part of a plot to destabilise Julia Gillard.
Well, we had a caucus vote, and I accept the results of that caucus vote, absolutely. The ministers, I think, are motivated by the national interest, and while the frustrations around this transition are understandable. It's a very trying circumstance when you've got Australians at one end of the country losing their jobs and these massive opportunities in the Pilbara and in the north of the country. So, that's a big transition for an economy to make. It's very hard to ask workers who have lost their jobs in New South Wales or Victoria or Tasmania to up and move to West Australia.
But this is so much at odds with what the Treasurer Wayne Swan has been saying as far as protecting the interests of the very rich and their interests as far as mining is concerned. And at a time when the government is desperate for votes, particularly of the ordinary workers, what does this say to those workers?
Well, there's a lot in your question. Look, I think there's this transition underway, this big economic transition, and it's obviously causing a lot of debate in the community. But what we've got to do is continue to grow the economy, and our economy is 16% bigger than it was prior to the GFC, so we're one of the few industrialised economies in the world that have grown. But while we're growing, we've got to make sure we share that wealth as well. One of the ways you share that wealth is through jobs. Another way you share that wealth is through the mining tax. We want to get the balance right between growing the economy and undertaking this transition and making sure people get opportunities in it. And one of the ways we do that is by getting people jobs. One of the ways we do that is by getting people skills, and one of the ways we do that is by having the mining tax. That spreads the benefits of these massive projects throughout the community.
Let's just move on. You are actually heading a parliamentary inquiry looking into why Australians are paying more for IT products. Why are they paying more?
Well, that's the question the inquiry's been set up to find out. There is a price differential. I, as a consumer, were a bit surprised to find out about it, but Ed Husick, who's the member for Chifley, has been really highlighting this issue for a year out there on Twitter and in the social media and in the newspapers, bringing to consumers, minds the fact that there is this gap, not just in music and e-books, but also in software and hardware. And what the committee's been formed to do as a result of Ed's lobbying is really to have a good look at this, to hear from Australian consumers, to hear from small business, and to hear from the producers of this of the product themselves, the big companies, as to why there are price differentials and how they're justified. Obviously, we want a market that brings the cheapest possible product to consumers, and we don't want to see large differentials between ourselves and overseas.
But particularly with the high Australian dollar, many consumers would wonder why those products haven't fallen significantly in price.
Well, that's exactly it, and I think that's a concern in the broader economy as well, as whether when there is these price movement or these currency appreciations, whether someone along the way isn't taking an extra, grabbing a bit of extra margin out of it on products. That is a concern, and I think we got to, as a parliament and with our regulatory bodies, put as much pressure on the market of these products as we can to provide transparent pricing and pricing that's justified.
And Nick Champion, just before you go, your reaction to, it looks as though Schapelle Corby will be released early on parole. Very hard to know exactly when, but what's your reaction to that?
Well, look, we've got to, obviously when people get into trouble overseas, they are, if you like, subject to that country's legal system. I respect the Indonesian legal system. I think it should be left to go through its own processes. We have to respect our neighbours and their legal systems as we would ask them to respect our own. But obviously, any time an Australian gets into trouble overseas, we'd prefer to see them home sooner rather than later.
Nick Champion, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, the decision to grant 457 visas to the mine project appeared badly timed, angering union leaders who were in Canberra yesterday to meet the Prime Minister about Australian jobs. Well, for more on the union perspective, we're joined by the National Secretary of the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union, Dave Noonan. Good morning, Dave. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Miriam.
So, Dave, what's your reaction to the government's decision regarding the mining jobs?
Well, what we've just heard from Mr Champion is a lot of spin and nonsense. The first thing to be said is that there is no requirement on Gina Rinehart's company to advertise jobs to Australians first. That's absolutely clear, and that was confirmed by Mr Bowen yesterday morning. So Mr Champion is not telling the Australian people the truth when he says that, and he really should go and check his facts. The fact is that there will be a minimum of 1,700 guest workers on this project, but the company can actually employ as many as they like in trades and above classifications. The announcement yesterday is about plant operators, riggers and scaffolders. Now, what we are seeing is a downturn in the construction industry along the eastern seaboard. What we are seeing is massive redundancies in manufacturing. Firms like Qantas, Kurri Kurri aluminium smelter, BlueScope have laid off lots of workers. The construction workers who are being laid off are job ready and could go to those jobs whenever required, at least those that are prepared to fly in and fly out. Many of the workers from manufacturing will have all or some of the skills that are required. In fact, the workers who are going to be brought from, we are told, China, the Philippines and Indonesia to do this work will need to be trained up to Australian standards and certified in Australia to do the jobs. So the proposition that we've got a skill shortage in this area and that's what's driven this decision is a complete myth.
Well, we've just heard Nick Champion, and he's arguing that in fact the project will also create 6,000 jobs. Is that a fair point?
Well, the project would create a lot more jobs for Australian workers if Australians were given the opportunity to apply for them first. What we've really seen here is a situation where Australia's migration policy has been handed over holus bolus to Gina Rinehart, the world's richest woman. And we know what Ms Rinehart's position on skilled migration to her projects is. She wants to see an economic zone across the north of Australia where guest workers are employed on third world developing country wages. And Australians need to seriously confront this. We're calling on Prime Minister Gillard to intervene in this process and to ensure that all projects have a requirement that Australian workers be hired first, that there be advertising for Australian workers first. Now, Mr Champion also talked about a jobs board. I wrote to the Immigration Minister 18 months ago saying that a jobs board ought to be established to ensure that Australian workers had a central point to register their skills and their willingness to work on these projects. It would also give employers an opportunity to go to the jobs board to first of all find out if there were suitably skilled people available, and it would test the veracity of whether in fact there is a skill shortage or not. The government has not acted to put a jobs board in place for Australian workers. However, Mr Bowen has announced that they've put a jobs board in place for employers who want to get 457 workers from overseas. If we want to have a proper skilled migration policy in this country, it needs to be operating in the interests of the Australian community, not in the interests of a few billionaires who want to drive down wages and conditions and have no regard for the circumstances of the broader Australian community.
So, Dave Noonan, in your opinion, work conditions for those coming into Australia on 457 work visas will be quite different to those of Australian workers?
Well, that's our experience. There is a principle that the ministers put in, which didn't exist under the coalition government, that says that workers should be paid at market rates. Now, in practice, employers can drive a truck through that principle. But what we see currently, including on another large resource project which is proceeding in the Pilbara at the moment, is Chinese workers being paid as little as 50 or 60% of what Australian workers are getting. They don't get R&R back with their families in China. They're flown to Karratha and housed 14 in a house. These are bonded labour conditions which are occurring now with the limited scheme that's in place, and yet the government, in the interests of Gina Rinehart, wants to expand this scheme without having the means to actually enforce the very limited protections that are in place for these workers.
Well, finally, Dave Noonan, it's understood from some reports that the Prime Minister wasn't foretold the specifics of this deal. Does that in fact surprise you?
I don't know what the Prime Minister knew. I don't know what the Prime Minister was advised of. That's a matter that Chris Bowen and the Prime Minister can have a discussion about. But I do know this. What we haven't had in this country is a proper debate in the community about why Australian workers should be standing behind guest workers in the line, why we should be going down the road of bonded labour in this country, and why we are not ensuring that the resources boom, which by the way is driving up the Australian dollar and causing a lot of the manufacturing job losses that we're seeing along the east coast, why that resources boom is not actually being used in the interests of all Australians rather than a few greedy, self-interested billionaires. That's what we would expect a Labor government to do.
And just briefly, do you expect to see some opposition from within the Labor caucus regarding this move?
I think that Paul Howe's description of this as political lunacy is absolutely apt. This is an issue which we have been flooded with calls, emails and texts from our members about. I think that there is a huge amount of disquiet amongst working Australians, particularly blue-collar Australians, manufacturing workers and tradies, about why Labor would engage in what is actually a sellout of Australian jobs in the interests of a few greedy billionaires.
Dave Noonan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Miriam.